In recent years, student achievement has improved dramatically in Florida's public schools. Fourth grade reading scores have risen from near the bottom to near the top of a respected national comparison. That's largely attributed to education reforms that the state began implementing in 1999. And now, as David Major reports, some of Arizona's educators and lawmakers are looking to duplicate Florida's success.
So that kids are ready.
The Arizona House of Representatives Education Committee is trying to improve education in the Grand Canyon state. But some of the bills on its agenda come directly from the Sunshine State. Florida has gained a national reputation for implementing education reforms that seem to have boosted student achievement. People behind the reform, like Patricia Levesque of the Foundation for Excellence in Education, believe what works in Florida will work in Arizona.
We think so. If you look at the data, Arizona was actually above Florida in student learning and student performance back in the early 90s. And then Arizona student performance has remained relatively flat. Florida, you can see a distinctive difference in our performance since 1999, which is when we put in the majority of these reforms.
Levesque is in Arizona this week talking with policymakers about Florida's success.
We're trying to share lessons learned, things that we experienced when we were at the bottom nationally, and now after a decade we're above the national average. So we're just trying to help other states see what they can do to follow with some policies to help kids learn.
One of those policies keeps third graders out of fourth grade until they're ready to read.
Educators know this, that from kindergarten through third grade, students are still learning how to read, but the teacher is the main one providing the instruction and the content. When students move to fourth grade, they have to read in order to learn. And if you promote a student to fourth grade who doesn't have successful reading skills, you're dooming them to a life of struggle and a greater potential that they're going to drop out or not graduate from high school. So switching that one policy to a skills policy. You go to fourth grade when we know you're ready, when we know that you have those foundational reading skills, made a tremendous impact.
She says it's also important to hold schools accountable by clearly grading them based on how kids do on tests.
So we started grading our schools like you grade students, A, B, C, D, F. You know, we graded them before, similar to Arizona. You know, you call your schools that we would call C schools, you call them performing here. And if most adults or the general public heard, wow, that school's performing, people would think that's fantastic. But in Florida, those schools get a C. And the reaction to a C is different than a reaction to a fuzzy descriptor like performing. C's, it's very clear to the parents, it's clear to the media, it's clear to the general public. They need to improve.
Those and other Florida policies have made it all the way across the country to Arizona, where they're included in a variety of bills lawmakers are trying to pass.
If Arizona does some of the policies that are floating through the legislative process right now, you won't see immediate results. It'll take time, it takes determination, it takes a comprehensive set of policies that make sure, again, the focus is on student learning, but Arizona could be where Florida is in a decade.
Here now to talk about importing Florida's education reforms to Arizona is Matthew Ladner, Vice President of Research for the Goldwater Institute, and John Wright, President of the Arizona Education Association, the state's largest teachers union. Thank you both for joining us tonight on Horizon.
Thank you.
Matthew, Goldwater Institute brought out the guest we just saw on the taped piece to Arizona to convince educators and lawmakers of what?
Well, the good news is that, you know, Arizona is today exactly where Florida was back in the 90s. They were down at the bottom of the rankings in the nation's report card exams. They were far below the average. Today, they've made dramatic improvement. They are a state that is similar to ours in demographics. They're a majority-minority state when you look at student demographics. They're not a high-spending state. They're a state that does not have an income tax. And they have a similar percentage of free reduced lunch eligible children in their schools as we do here. What has happened over since the late 1990s is that Florida has made dramatic improvement. Arizona has been flat in their scores. The improvement has been so profound that the average Florida child is now reading about a grade and a half level higher than the average Arizona child in fourth grade reading.
John, Education Week, Florida ranked 8th. They were 31st in 2007. They're now 8th. What are they doing right?
Well, we want to learn from other states, and we want to learn from best practices, and this isn't to pit Arizona against Florida. That would be pointless. I think if you listened to the woman who came, you heard her talk about differences in the early 90s. And the steepest increases that Florida saw in both reading and math scores was between 1994 and 2002, before most of these reforms took place. So I think we have to look at the overall length of time. Now, in recent gains, can we learn from some of what Florida has done? Yes. They spend $1,500 more per child. They have spent millions in reading intervention, reading recovery, family literacy. There are governor's programs, there are private programs, and there are public programs. They have invested in their reading systems and reading intervention in ways that Arizona can only dream of. So yes, let's look at those practices.
And there are some studies and some educators who say that it looks as though Arizona would need to spend 20% more per pupil to hit what Florida is right now. Is that how you see it?
It's not clear because these national ranking of spending, as I've talked about on your show before, are unclear. Florida is not a high spending state, neither is Arizona. I think that we can conclude that. But Florida actually got almost a grade level's worth of improvement in reading scores between 1998 and 2002. And their increased spending per pupil, adjusted for inflation, was about $110 per pupil. They did spend money on things like high-quality data systems. They did create financial incentives for success in schools, and they created disincentives for failure. So some of the things they did require some money, but more than money and more than anything about the gory details of policy, what Florida did was to take some really tough-minded decisions that they were very determined to improve student performance. And the good news is that what Florida's success shows us is that we are not doomed to suffer along at a flatlining and near the bottom of the barrel in academic achievement. We can do better.
Well, I would also say that Arizona scores are not near the bottom of the barrel, so we can talk apples to apples, and we're doing around the middle of the range, national average, and that's not good enough. You will hear some legislators say, we're national average on these scores, isn't that okay? And we have to say, no, that's not okay. We need to make tough decisions to move from the middle to the top.
Some of the gory details of public policy, let's get into a couple of them here. The idea of grading schools instead of performing, underperforming, this kind of just A, B, C, D. Makes sense to you?
Simplistic, and it's not going to work. A couple of people have said, who really knows what these terms in Arizona mean? I think you can get a pretty clear meaning of excelling, performing, underperforming. I think those are pretty clear. I'm an elementary school teacher. I stopped using letter grades with my second graders a long time ago because they didn't give them a clear indication of performance. We are a standards-based academic system. We have to let students know where they're doing related to standards, and we have to let the public know where schools are going related to standards. A, B, C, D, that's not the answer.
Well, I disagree. I think, as you heard Ms. Levesque talk on your intro piece, no one is going to be desperate to get their school out of a performing label. In Florida, that same school would be described as having a C. It's also the case here that the national test shows in fourth grade reading that 44% of Arizona fourth graders scored below basic in reading in 2007. That is a polite way to describe functional literacy. And yet the state is covered with schools that are called performing. That simply is not a system that has credibility, and it is also not a system that is driving improvement. Florida's, A, B, C, D, or F system helps to clarify that which schools need improvement. It rallies community support around those schools.
So the real issue is, what is the data that leads to the label? It's not if you use this word or that letter, but are we collecting the right data? Does the data give us a good indication of student learning and room for growth? And that's what we really need to look at. What are we collecting and analyzing?
Florida, among the things that are collected, I guess, and analyzed in Florida is testing a program for what seems like every grade, but really concentrating on that third grade reading test and holding kids back if they don't reach a certain level. Again, your thoughts?
Well, I think that third grade reading level is critical, and educators realize that. The misunderstanding is that any third grader who doesn't meet proficiency is held back. What they do in consultation is retain about 10%, the 10% of the lowest performing third graders. There are other intervention strategies and reading recovery strategies. Those are the kind of decisions you make at the school level with the parents. I've raised 4 children and made dozens and dozens and dozens of education decisions. I don't want Matthew Ladner or the Arizona legislature making any of those decisions about retention or anything else. That's for the parent, the teacher, and the school to decide what's best for which child.
And there's a concern with retention as well, in that some of these kids, by the time they get to teenage years and they are not with their peers anymore, there's a concern regarding dropout rates there. Comment, please.
Well, I mean, I think the cruelest thing we can do to kids, and it happens every day, and this is not about making the state making decisions for schools. This is about having some standards. The cruelest thing we can do to a child is to pass them on into later elementary school and into middle school as illiterate. These children become 7th graders. They have a science book in front of them. They literally cannot read, right? They never envision themselves going to college. They start to wonder what they're doing there. They get bored, they get disruptive, they start dropping out in large numbers in 8th grade, okay? Those kids have been passed through a system, right, just, you know, as the cruelest fate you could possibly have, you know, for a student. That's got to stop. And to stop that, you have to make tough decisions. And John is right. The retention rate now is about 10%, but it used to be a lot higher than that. And the reason that it has dropped is because fewer students are scoring at the initial lowest level, right? More kids are learning how to read. And since the initial retention in 2003, the percentage of kids that have been retained has dropped by 40%. The percentage of kids that are scoring low enough to be retained has also dropped by 40%.
Why do you think those numbers are?
Because the whole system, I mean, part of the things is that we do need to put some responsibility onto parents, right? And this does that, right? There is a clear signal sent through the system that your child needs to learn how to read. When your child is assigned homework and reading, they better do it, right? If they want to move on with their peers, right, they're going to have to take some responsibility for this. Plus, there are earlier interventions in the system. This incentivizes them to focus on reading early, which is developmentally critical.
Does that make sense to you?
That's exactly what I was saying. Early interventions, developmentally appropriate, make the investments, have conversations with parents. What you don't want to have is this automatic barrier that pops up because of a student test score, and that determines what a student does in school for the following year. These are consultations to have based on standards, clear expectations, and intervention at the earliest possible year.
The test scores for 4th grade reading skills in Florida, they have improved. They have shown an upward rise there. Again, if the numbers seem to show this, is it not a good thing to consider, not a good thing to emulate?
I think the good parts to emulate are just what Matt was describing. Intervention, parent involvement, consultation and conversations, understanding collectively that reading is critical. You don't just send your kid off to school and wait for the results to come back. It's a shared partnership, and that's very different than automatic determinants that come from test scores.
What about the concept of learning? That some criticism of what Florida's doing and some other approaches to education, test, 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 but are we really finding out if these kids are learning anything?
Well, I think, yes, we are. I mean, it is absolutely essential that you learn how to read. Kids have to learn how to read to do anything, any kind of subject later on in life. It's absolutely critical. So we do need testing. There does need to be accountability. There needs to be transparency in the system for that. That's an area that we're fairly sorely lacking in here in Arizona at this point.
You agree?
Assessments serve a purpose, and you won't find a teacher that doesn't use and analyze assessment data critically. But there are some factors of a child or a teenager's education you can't get on a paper and pencil test. What is their self-motivation? What is their view of their future opportunity for success? How do you contribute to those affective growth areas as a teacher and as a school community? We can't start ignoring those just because we've got to add up the numbers at the end of each year for the test results.
Is Arizona prepared to pay more for education? At least pay as much as Florida is paying?
Right now, we face a gigantic structural budget deficit, and I think whether the sales tax proposal passes or not, the truth is there is not going to be money for any increases in public school spending anytime soon. In fact, there's likely to be cuts. Having said that, I actually think that it is absolutely still possible for us to make progress, to get better bang for the buck, the way Florida has, whether you know that new money materializes or not.
Better bang for the buck possible?
Spend money wisely, but we cannot keep cutting the way we're cutting now because we're simply pulling the rugs right out from underneath the teachers' feet.
All right, we'll stop it right there. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you.